I'm Mark Golub, and it's a joy to begin the Jewish New Year with you. I hope all of you had a most wonderful holiday that was meaningful to you and uplifting, and that you're starting the new year in health and with great anticipation for you and all whom you love. I also want to thank all of you who sent me such lovely emails and cards wishing me well and wishing all of us here at JBS Shalom TV as we begin our year together with this expanded name Jewish broadcasting service. You are wishing all of us the very best, and I thank you very, very much. And so, in the news is a Rosh Hashanah sermon that's received a great deal of attention on the internet and perhaps in the Jewish community as a whole. A dear friend, Bob Selig, who has helped to make JBS Shalom TV possible. Bob and his wife Joyce watch JBS in Laconia, New Hampshire on Metrocast. And during the recent holiday, Bob sent me a powerful Rosh Hashanah sermon by Rabbi Shalom Lewis, who's the rabbi of Congregation Eitz Chaim, a progressive conservative synagogue in the Atlanta suburb of Marietta, Georgia. And in his sermon, Rabbi Lewis addressed the threat of radical Islam to the Western world, describing it as a war of civilizations between radical Islam and the West, including the United States of America. Actually, this is the second time Shalom Lewis has spoken of the threat of radical Islam. In 2010, he delivered a sermon entitled Er Kommt, Yiddish for They're Coming. This year's sermon is entitled Er Da, They Are Here. And the thrust of Shalom Lewis's message is that radical Muslims, whom Rabbi Lewis cites as being roughly no more than 5% of the more than 1 billion Muslims in the world today, that radical Muslims who practice an extreme form of Islamic Sharia law and who believe in the violent imposition of Sharia law upon the world are represented in a host of extreme fanatical Muslim groups such as, of course, ISIS, but also Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and the current regime in Iran. Rabbi Lewis also argues that while only 5% of Muslims are radical and extreme, he does not see the other 95% of Muslims taking any strong stand against the radical extremists or expressing public outrage and condemnation of the radical 5%. And so Shalom Lewis argues that Americans, including the American administration and American Jews, must wake up to the fact that they are in as savage a war as the world once fought against Nazi Germany. And he is critical of the Obama administration's lack of total support for the state of Israel during this summer's war in Gaza. Now here's a piece of Rabbi Lewis's sermon. Media coverage during the war was biased and shameful, with a few notable exceptions. To permit Hamas spokesmen and Hamas sympathizers to speak and to defend their monstrous deeds to millions of viewers is morally shocking. To promote equivalency between Israel and Hamas is morally appalling. Now, there are those who think that Shalom Lewis was rather courageous to give such a sermon, and they agree with his description of the war the West is in now against radical Islam. But Shalom Lewis has also faced a torrent of criticism for his piece, a virtual tsunami of criticism, just horrific. I'll give you one example. Adam Horowitz is the 39-year-old co-editor of the website Mondoweiss, which describes itself as a website devoted to covering American foreign policy in the Middle East, chiefly from a progressive Jewish perspective, and offering alternatives to pro-Zionist ideology as a basis for American Jewish identity. So you understand where Adam Horowitz is coming from. And Adam Horowitz wrote a piece on Mondoweiss entitled, "Read the Genocidal Sermon a Notable Atlanta Rabbi Gave This Rosh Hashanah." A genocidal sermon. That's what Adam Horowitz tells his readers Shalom Lewis wrote. Last Thursday, Rabbi Shalom Lewis of Congregation Eitz Chaim in the Atlanta suburb of Marietta, Georgia, gave what can only be understood as a call to genocide in his Rosh Hashanah sermon to welcome in the Jewish New Year. The sermon calls for war on Islam and Muslims worldwide. Lewis says a, quote, holy crusade, unquote, against Islam is needed to, quote, exterminate it utterly and absolutely, unquote. Now, if Shalom Lewis said anything like that, it would be grounds for calling it genocidal. But now I want you to look at what Rabbi Lewis actually wrote. Here's his words from his sermon, Rabbi Shalom Lewis. I say it again loudly, slowly, and clearly. We are at war, here in America as well, with radical Islamists. We are at war with radical Islamists. Rabbi Shalom Lewis never says anywhere in his sermon that the war is with Islam, as Adam Horowitz suggests. Rabbi Lewis makes it so very clear he is only speaking of radical Islam. He defines the enemy in careful and precise terms. And what about his calling for a, quote, holy crusade, unquote, as Adam Horowitz claims he does? This is all that Rabbi Shalom Lewis says, quote, if we fail in this holy crusade, we will live in a world bereft of color. And when Shalom Lewis uses the phrase holy crusade, Shalom Lewis is referring to a war against radical Islam and only against radical Islam. And in the two sentences before the reference to a holy crusade, Shalom Lewis says, the fury of ultimate evil is upon us, and we must act, not to contain it, not to degrade it, not to manage it, not to tolerate it, but to exterminate it utterly and absolutely. To exterminate what? Utterly and absolutely. Adam Horowitz would have his readers believe Rabbi Lewis is talking about all Islam. But the sermon, again, is totally clear. What Shalom Lewis is arguing the West should not tolerate, but should exterminate utterly and absolutely, is radical Islam. How in the world does Adam Horowitz have the gall to distort Rabbi Lewis's words so maliciously and horribly? How dare he equate a war against radical Islam with genocide, as if Rabbi Lewis was calling for the extermination of all Muslims? Horowitz charges Lewis with calling for a war on Islam and Muslims worldwide. Nowhere in his sermon, nowhere, the Shalom Lewis call for a war on Islam. Nowhere. Nowhere does Lewis call for a war against Muslims worldwide. Nowhere. Shame on Adam Horowitz. Shame. His piece is un-Jewish, un-American, and most significantly of all, Adam Horowitz represents an inauthentic liberalism that is an epidemic spreading throughout a significant portion of the once proud and noble liberal Jewish community, which has now turned its back on all reason, debate, and honest inquiry. There remains an authentic liberalism in the Jewish community today, which passionately defends the rights of minorities, women, gays, which is committed to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of intellectual honesty, and which abhors bigotry and racism and intellectual fascism, and the willingness to purposely distort and fabricate and lie about another person's position because of a preconceived emotional bias to another point of view. But there's nothing authentically liberal in Adam Horowitz's piece. And Adam Horowitz and those who've piled on against Shalom Lewis have forfeited all credibility with their readers. And please understand me, no one has to agree with Shalom Lewis's view of the threat of radical Islam. If one disagrees with him, thinks Shalom Lewis is wrong, just explain where is he wrong and why is he wrong. But don't malign him. Don't misrepresent totally the point of his message. And on our phones right now, from Atlanta, Georgia, it's my pleasure to welcome to JBS Shalom TV the Rabbi of Congregation Eitz Chaim of Marietta, Rabbi Shalom Lewis. Shalom, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Mark. Good to be here.
Well, Shalom, have you been sort of taken by surprise by the extent of the vitriolic criticism that's come your way since delivering your sermon on Rosh Hashanah?
Well, I must tell you that after Yom Kippur, I was hoping to just relax a little bit, but things began to heat up with great regularity. Perhaps I was surprised by the extent of the response, the hostile response. I received a great deal of support from my congregation, from the community, and frankly from people throughout the world who have read the sermon and understood it, and as you described it with great accuracy in your introduction. But the viciousness of the enemy simply validates and vindicates what I was saying in the sermon, and I believe that the extent of the nastiness and the libelous remarks, clearly I hit a raw nerve, and I'm at least glad that I did.
Okay. Shalom, whom were you trying to speak to with your sermon? You know, every rabbi who gets up in front of a congregation has in his mind whom he's trying to speak to and perhaps to influence. I'm wondering, when you gave this sermon, did you imagine you were speaking to members of your congregation who did not agree with you and whom, in essence, you were trying to convince?
I don't think so. I had a message, a very serious message, a very real message, a very sad message. And when I spoke, I was speaking to the congregation. I can never tell and never know if my words are going to be received and then go viral as the sermon did. So my intention was to speak to my congregation, stir them to understand the great threat that we are facing right now from radical Islam, and hope that they would respond by doing something about it, learning more about it, being more proud as Jews and as Americans, and understand that there was a true and authentic existential threat to Western civilization.
Okay, and I want to push you a little bit here. Are you suggesting to me that you feel, this is not about your congregation, but your congregation represents American Jewry, a slice of American Jewry. Are you concerned, Shalom, that American Jews in general don't get it yet, don't understand the threat, A, of Islamic radical fundamentalism, and B, the way in which organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and others in the anti-Israel Arab world are a real legitimate threat, not only to Israel, but to the West?
You know, that's a great question, and the what my answer or response to that would be, very simply, that we live here in America. We get up in the morning, we go to work, we play Little League, we go golfing, we go to restaurants, we take cruises. Life for us can be completely separated from the reality of what's going on. If we chose not to read a newspaper and not to turn on a television, then our lives would pretty much progress the way they are. We are living in a bubble, a wonderful bubble, a democratic bubble, a safe bubble, but nevertheless a bubble. And so I would think that for many, there is a disconnect with what is going on overseas. To shake them up is important because they can live a life without being exposed to or seeing the ugliness that is just a few thousand miles away. But as we travel, and as many of my members have traveled to Europe, were with me in Israel when the bombs were raining upon us, the rockets, people are beginning to wake up and to see what's going on. And I believe that inside of them they had this feeling, and the fact that I got up there and said what was inside them resonated profoundly and deeply with most of the congregation.
That's very interesting for me to hear. And I'm relating to this in almost with two hats. I mean, I wanted you to come on JBS Shalom TV because I thought your piece was very important, and I thought the way you were hammered on the internet by a lot of left-wing writers really was, it was more than unfair, Shalom. It distorted the words they put in your mouth if they read the sermon and you never said them. So it bothered me intellectually. But I'm also interested as a rabbi, and I led holiday services myself, and in my congregation, which by the way is called Chavarat Eitz Chaim, so we share that.
We have a connection.
Yes, I tend to talk a lot on Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of Yom Kippur about issues having to do with the personal quest for whatever kind of better world we want to create for ourselves and to be as lovely human beings as we possibly can be. And then at some point in the progression, as the rabbis created this extraordinary 10-day journey, I moved to larger and larger concerns. And then this year I did speak about some things that you spoke about as well. And I was very, very impressed with what you wrote. I felt it was very courageous. And I felt two things, and that's really why I'm asking you. But wait, how long have you been a rabbi?
I've been with my shul since 1977.
Do you mind my asking how old you are?
I am 65.
Okay, so you're still a young kid.
Very young, very young.
Okay, are you JTS?
JTS, yes.
Okay. So as I read your piece, and again, you heard somebody sent it to me because they thought it was fabulous. I said to myself, I imagine Shalom is speaking especially to people who he wants to make sure they get it, and he's concerned they don't already. And I want you to react to this experience I have had, both here at JBS Shalom TV and also as a practicing rabbi myself, that there are now three groups of American Jews, Shalom, and I want you to tell me if you think I've got it right or how you would want to correct me. One group of Jews is passionately supportive of the state of Israel, understands the extent to which the war this summer was thrust upon Israel. They had no choice. They were defending their children, their women, and their men, and they did everything they possibly could to spare as many lives as possible. And there's a certain pride we take while we are, while it pains us to see Israel have to go to war, we're also very proud of the way they do it. And we feel the media was viciously distortive of how the war was actually being fought. That's one group. There's a second group, which is simply represented by the Adam Horowitz piece. Israel will never do anything right. No matter what Israel does, they're the bad guy. And their perspective is that if Israel treated the Palestinian better, if they redressed the Palestinian grievances, primarily the West Bank occupation and the blockade of Gaza, if Israel would only stop its apartheid and cruel subjugation of the Palestinian, there would be no problem, no conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, and basically the problem is Israel. And then there's a third group, and this is what I want to hear you speak to. This third group wants to support the state of Israel, feels a kinship with things Jewish, but they also have a what they believe, and I'm not questioning it, a heightened sense of Jewish morality. And when they watched the war this past summer, and they read your piece, they feel that there is not enough compassion, not enough concern, that Israel went too far. Israel killed Palestinian children. Israel hit a hospital. Israel hit a UN building that was housing Gazans who were trying to escape from the war. And that when I hear them speak, they say almost sadly, Israel isn't living up to what Israel should be, and that Israel was the aggressor in the war. And they don't understand the extent to which ISIS and Hamas are in fact one. And that if I had to imagine whom Shalom Lewis wanted to reach most during his Rosh Hashanah sermon, it was group number 2, this middle group who need to have some perspective that perhaps can move them to a greater understanding of the situation Israel is in. That's my breakdown of the 3 groups. Please, give me any analysis you have.
All right. As we say, al regel achat, even though I'm sitting down on one foot, very simply, there are those that are going to be supportive of Israel and get it, don't need to be educated by me. They read, they're involved, and so forth. Not a problem. There is the extreme left-wing progressive group within the Jewish community and beyond that no matter what, it is a pathology of hate that they have for Israel, and ultimately it is nothing less than masked anti-Semitism, and for the Jew, self-hatred.
Yes.
There is a vast community there, the one you identified, the third community, that is struggling. And I believe that that when the dust settles and they are serious in their pursuit of truth and their pursuit of understanding what actually happened in this Gaza war and what is happening throughout the world that is on fire now with Islamic radicalism, they will begin to understand. I think one of the important parts of my sermon was to say that Israeli blood bleeds in the same way that the blood of the journalists bled as well, who were beheaded by ISIS. Because even in the administration, I understand there is a distinction that they are trying to draw, and some are trying to draw between ISIS and Hamas and the others. ISIS, Hamas, the Taliban, as you said at the beginning, they are all the same. And it is important for us as a country and as Jews to understand that there is no distinction. ISIS is no worse than Hamas. The only difference is the beheading was much more dramatic, but the evil is comparable. And so I believe that my sermon did shake up a lot of people.
In what way? In what way?
I think it convinced them that what they wanted to believe was, but couldn't articulate or wouldn't bring to expression, did indeed and did in fact get expressed by me with a, frankly, with a certain amount of eloquence and drama. And I think it touched them, and they realized what the truth really was.
I want to give you one more reaction, and I want to hear how you respond. There was somebody who read your piece, sent me an email that said the following: I agree with Shalom Lewis 100%. Unfortunately, he is politically incorrect. And I wrote back to this individual, give me one sentence, one line, one observation that Shalom Lewis made which was politically incorrect. And the person couldn't do it. And said to me afterward, you know, it's interesting. There is a mood among liberals that you just don't say bad things about other people. And although Shalom Lewis did not say anything bad anywhere in his piece about a group, about Muslims in general, about Islam in general, the criticism you received on the internet and the response this reader had when I got this email is because of this obsession with politically correct. And I am not minimizing how important it is for people to be careful in how they talk about other groups, about the other. At the same time, political correctness should never blind us to the truth. And I wondered if you had any, first of all, it's an interesting thing for you to know about how somebody reacted to your piece, but in general, what's your response to the notion of, you know, politically correct as it applies to radical Islam today?
Well, I think that being politically correct has muzzled an awful lot of expression and a great deal of dialogue, and that should have been out there. And a lot of people who are politically correct will tiptoe around, will be delicate, and so on. You know, you can't make progress by being politically correct. You can't tiptoe around real issues because somebody is going to be offended always. And if we operated in a world of total political correctness, then no one would ever say anything about anybody because somebody inevitably is going to be offended and upset. To be politically correct means basically that one cannot be honest and forthright with their words. And at the end of the sermon, to me, one of the most important lines was at the end where I said that the difference between us has nothing to do with our faith and has nothing to do with our holy books. The difference today is between decency and indecency, righteousness and corruption, savagery and civilization, right and wrong. That is the distinction that we have to draw today. And on the side of decency and righteousness, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are Muslims, and that is, to me, what is the defining point in my sermon. And the decent people of this planet have to eliminate the indecency that is in this planet, and the only way you get motivated is by talking about it and not parsing and filtering every single word that is uttered.
Shalom Lewis, you wrote a spectacular sermon. It's online for anybody who wants to see it. Kol tuva hatzlacha and yasha koach. May you continue to go from strength to strength. I hope you'll let me call you to reflect on some other issues confronting American and world Jewry today. But I thank you so much, not only for being here with me for a little bit, but also for writing something that needed to be said. Yasha koach, shalom.
Thank you very much, and a Chag Sameach, and to your listeners as well, a Good Yontif, a Chag Sameach, and I'm honored to have been on your show.
Thank you very, very much. Rabbi Shalom Lewis, whose Rosh Hashanah sermon, Erdoah, he delivered at Congregation Eitz Chaim in Marietta, Georgia, lays out what he believes is a war of civilizations between radical Islam and the West. Again, if you can, go online and read it. I think it's extremely well done. Of course, as always, I'd love to hear your reactions to the things that Shalom Lewis had to say. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, and tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. My thanks to Sloan Copeland, Serge Goldberg, Dara Golub, and our producer for this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.